not to be self-delusional that my recordings are listened to by Eric Weinstein. I heard him talk to someone on the portal. I don't know even if this is a recent interview or an old interview, when he was sort of describing himself, and this is a rejoinder for the thing that I said. I made this recording saying liberal intellectualism is dead, or the death of liberal intellectualism, or something like that, in which I was complaining at at both Bret and Eric and Sam Harris, sort of essentially this, what I can only see as a kind of propensity towards some kind of, moral majoritarianism, or or kind of trying to cultivate a healthy groupthink or something like that. And I understand that that's a bit of a vague aspersion to cast at someone. But I just want to go into this interview with Bret. Sorry, not that Eric was having, when he called himself, I can't remember how many antis he used, but he says, like, I'm actually in a new position now where I'm anti the anti-Trumpers, or I can't remember how many antis there were, but essentially he's sick of the people who are anti the anti-Trumpers, essentially, I believe is what I followed. That the people who are anti the anti-Trumpers, like, they need to go one level of abstraction deeper, that they're being gamed and played or whatever. And then he gave some interesting general sort of things, and he called that contemplative space his own private hell, because essentially he's on no one's side, and he's just sort of fed up with the whole sort of confected scenario in some sense. And I want to say that that's his own fault. It's his own fault for taking such a hypothetical moral standpoint, in which one is just saying, well, look, I'm not going to participate because it's so, I'm not going to treat these as it's not a staged event, that it's not a sort of, that it's not a trap for the left to fall into, or the so-called left. You see, to me, you can't even describe them as the left, and I'm sure Eric doesn't describe them as the proper left in some sense. They have a nominal left label left over to them, or something like that. But in some sense, even as the whole thing is horribly choreographed in some sense, if you want to sort of just say, well, the whole thing is choreographed, so I'm just going to attack anyone that's participating in it. I mean, just imagine dealing with that level, being opposed to the so-called left that's still inherited that nominal title. How would you dismantle their bullshit in some sense? In some sense, your imaginary world is, well, all the gatekeepers belong to me, and they are reasonable and not insane, and they haven't already sort of let the rot in. But they have. That's not the world that we live in, and sort of playing this hypothetical sort of devil's advocate, in which you can afford to be anti the anti-Trumpers, is just. Yeah, I mean, it deserves to be correctly named your private hell, and it's your fault for putting yourself in that detached, abstracted, sort of contemplative judgment on the system, where you're just like, well, what's to be done about it? Like, well, it shouldn't even be happening. So because it shouldn't even be happening, we can just sort of, if we all just take my perspective, then we'll sort of get back to the baseline, or something like that. I mean, it's a kind of wishful thinking. It's a kind of based purely on its moral sort of the sense of its own moral self-referencing, sort of moral authority in some sense. And the problem with it is that it's essentially, it's a hypothetical, abstracted, disembodied, sort of contemplative scenario that doesn't bear reference to what's actually going on, and it can only continue to do that if it can say, well, what's going on is just so absurd and choreographed and sort of fundamentally unsound that it's worthy of just being ignored. And if you want to ignore reality so that you can continue to sort of generate this hypothetical moral authority, or this moral, sort of certitude or sanctimony that deserves to be your private hell, Eric Weinstein. So that's my point on that. And and to me there is a bit of nescience in when he's all the things that he says about this, all if the Democrats would, if the Republicans try to sort of win the election by just being pro the nuclear family, and then the Democrats would complain that they, just said the word, that they were pronouncing it incorrectly. I mean, there is a substantive difference that is not just as superficial as that's going on in the culture war, that's going on with this loony so-called left, which, I mean, to me is indistinguishable from fascism and the kind of hyperrealism peddled by sort of the Nazi propaganda and such. And to some extent, Trump is playing on that and accelerating that, which is, it's good that he is doing that. Imagine if he wasn't doing that and it just continued to fester and grow and expand its influence. Imagine if Trump wasn't baiting it so well. Imagine how screwed it would be. I mean, and I'll say again that the Republican Party is much further along in its potential for progress and evolution out of, let's say, the sorry state of politics. If you want to look at the Democratic Party compared to the Republican Party is at least having some kind of discussion when it's sort of putting some of these Republican politicians under the heat for, marching with Black Lives Matter and just going along with this bullshit, as opposed to the Democratic Party where that's impossible to have that discussion in some sense. So, I mean, it's generally a very, very sorry state, but at least there is some depth in terms of actually fathoming the depth of the dishonesty and the disingenuousness and the kind of, and the show aspect of politics, the kind of the showmanship of politics, which Trump has generally been very good at facilitating the exposition thereof, exposing. To me, perhaps I'm much more hands-on with all of this stuff because of my much more psychological perspective and my much more sort of nuanced, I would say, analysis of the forces at work here. And politics hopefully will change at the end of it. That we will get to a more real sort of politics in some sense, and it will be a different kind of politics, because politics that existed before was just a bit too delusional, a bit too surreal. And the Overton window is going to sort of move where the center, where the middle ground is liberal, democratic, classical liberalism and anti-authoritarianism, and how to sort of measure that against the kind of the authoritarian so-called solutions that big collective, sort of things have to try to offer. And I do think that there is a kind of reticence and a reluctance for people like Bret and Eric, perhaps even Sam as well. I don't know, Sam is not really such a good political commentator anyway. To actually track the I mean, I don't want to be too unkind because, I'm making generalizations, Uh, I mean, I think in some sense there is a huge amount of positive force that could be done if there was an intelligent political party that actually had the political capital, which can't even exist in the current environment, to invest into, let's say, long-term integrity or stability or long-term progress, in terms of like doing something because it's bad in the short term, but in the long term will provide collateral support for other institutions and functions or whatever, that you're putting your house in order in an intelligent fashion. And essentially we can't afford intelligent politicians because the whole thing is built on lies and deception. um, so we can't even have the kind of, the beginning of a responsible politics in some sense. um, And we can also know that in some sense, Trump is very good at, in the culture war, which is an important part of actually solving this political problem. That he is in some sense draining the swamp. When you are looking at Republican politicians that are marching with Black Lives Matter, and you just say, well, what the fuck is that about? Like, how is this any way connected to reality, other than this ideological bullshit? This is the cultural mask that irresponsible politics takes. That it'll just go along with the crowd. It'll just go along with the groupthink. It'll disguise itself. And so I do think that my point in the liberal intellectualism is dead still stands, because essentially there's this idea that if we just go back to the way things were in some sense, well, the way things were able to be taken over by this bullshit. So how good was it really? How much integrity did it really have? How much intellectual sort of internal bones and structure did it even have, if it couldn't withstand this utterly contemptuous, laughable, ludicrous, mediocre pseudo intellectualism? If it made way for that, how good could it have even been? Okay, so that's my rejoinder to the point, I guess. And trying to go back to this hypothetical disembodied, sort of, I do think that is a kind of intellectual defense mechanism that Eric was essentially espousing in order to try to cement and to fortify this position, um, which is the kind of idea that you can just kind of have. I mean, I'm very vaguely describing this, the kind of the moral majority sort of stuff that I said and stuff like that. That there is a good groupthink that can be cultivated and that can carry the tide and society forward. And I do think that in some sense that there is a version of politics that is fundamentally dangerous, and the non-participation in the real, into relegating the real political line as they are drawn, means that there'll be no bridge to actually forging, because you're not modeling responsible politics in that sense. Now, obviously, I don't want to be too critical, because Eric's podcast is actually great. It really is. Going into issues in a deep sort of way. But I think that there's a level of character development. There's a level of psychological sort of probity that needs to be gotten into, in terms of. I wouldn't call this a lack of courage. I would call this a lack of resolve or resolution in some sense. And so you are crafting your own private hell out of a lack of resolve, in terms of wanting essentially to just be done with this horrid state, and that some better condition should just appear out of the woodwork organically, if we cross our arms and across our chest, and with folded arms we just wait for it, but that's not going to happen. And I do think that in the meantime, it is actually worthy to throw some complimentary comments at Donald Trump. And not doing so, in some sense, is a kind of doubling down on showing a kind of intellectual sympathy with the mob, even as it stands at the moment as well. And it's not a and there isn't a robust enough, let's say, repudiation of politics as how it used to be, in which was in such a state that it allowed itself to be corrupted by this bullshit. So, so I think those threads need to be taken account of, and someone needs to take responsibility for that. Someone needs to speak to that. And I would think that. So to me, it's embarrassing when I hear Bret and Eric talk about Trump in these indirect, disembodied, abstracted, over intellectual things in which they don't even make contact with the issues because it's just too sensitive. They don't want to be on the wrong side of history or something like that, or they don't want to sort of poison their credentials in their as they are plugged into the left-leaning, I don't know, way of thinking in the world or something like that. To me, I see a form of inbred sort of collusive sort of groupthink, which I still, the intellectual dark web was premised, let's say, on the opposite of that. But I think that there's a form of diplomacy in politics that is being played in the crafting of the message, and I do think that, I don't know, I don't think it's being captured by your audience. I think it's being captured by a calculus in one's belief system and a kind of chess, a plotting chess. And in some sense, it's just, I think real intellectualism does need a sense of humility, does need a sense of making itself susceptible and vulnerable. And it does look slightly undignified because you look a bit like a child because you're sort of thinking as you're talking, that you're not speaking from a hymn sheet, that you're not speaking from a narrative that has to have this pristine, robust concreteness about it. And I do think that there is this sense that, well, if you're telling anyone anything, it must be part of a solid worldview narrative that can't have the space for adaptation and revision and mistakes or whatever. And they are too afraid to speak like a child in the face of the mob, in that they're going to be castigated by the mob, they're going to be swallowed by the mob, they're going to be cannibalized and maligned. And I guess the cost is too high for where they are in their situation, perhaps. To be made to look a fool for saying perhaps something complimentary to Trump, or something like that, and so then they pay the price that they can't connect to politics as it stands. They can't make a bridge from where we are to some place new because they can't even talk about it directly. They can only talk about it through this disembodied, abstract, intellectual, hypothetical moralizing. And I am calling it out. That's exactly what I'm doing. I'm calling it out. I'm sorry if I anyway, that's my perspective. So just to summarize the point, I mean, I'm basically saying, well, specifically to essentially to Eric Weinstein, that it is only yourself that is forcing yourself to inhabit this disconnected moral perch, which is dislocated from being able to really engage in the bridge from here to there. So you're choosing to be disconnected, and I think that disconnection is somewhat a necessary disconnection because of your revulsion to the woke left, but your inability to sort of to handle the tokens and the symbols that are very, let's say, precious to them or triggering to them in some sense, because you don't want to be cast as their villain in their narrative in some sense, perhaps, or I mean, you're capable of withstanding that if it happens in a very clear-cut, obvious way in which that you don't fall into their narrative. But in some sense, if you take up a more sort of partisan line or a more sort of engaged cultural line in ostensibly siding with their enemy or lending some sort of credence to their enemy or something like that, where I do think that your position would be a lot stronger if you said, well, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and I will provide a level of friendship that is also critical, and that you actually find exactly where you're critical and where you are aligned. And in that definition, you actually have you are incorporating a bridge, a platform as to, in some sense, if you had to articulate that, if you did articulate that, that would be like roughly a roadmap to the ideological movement that the Democratic Party would have to make in order to fix itself. That would at least be that would be a tangible example of a borne out, tangible sort of indicator of what positive change would look like in the so-called left. That it would have to sort of and in as much as that you don't lend any moral cover just because they are to people that are nominally on the other side of you, that are right and not left, something like that. I think the entire sort of situation of what's going on is impoverished to that extent. It is layered in a murkiness which lends itself towards the conspiracy theory of the woke left, or whatever you want to call it, of the systemic oppression, and the kind of you are in some sense giving them space to operate in by sort of taking this kind of very strict agnostic sort of line against their enemies, that you will be neutral, that you will be Switzerland or something like that, I could probably articulate this, somebody else could articulate this argument much better than I could, essentially, but that is the general sort of predicament, that you're forcing yourself to be Switzerland, and to me it's conspicuous. And the kind of intellectualism that you're doing in order to justify the Swiss, the Swiss, sort of position is frankly, I don't know how to say this. I'm just going to say it bluntly. In some sense, this is overstating the point, but I'm just going to say it anyway. That it's toxic, and it has a kind of toxic intellectual sympathy that plays into the wokeness, that plays into how they operate as a groupthink. Yeah, and I have stated that, I guess, already. So that is, again, just to reiterate the point. I'll say as well that the lack of positive opportunism in essentially sorting out problems is a problem here. The idea that, oh no, you can't say anything nice about Trump because that might embolden the Republican Party, and essentially they're not the perfect political solution, and who knows what's coming next from the Republican side. But they are, in some technical, cultural sense, in some dimensions, they're certainly way better than the Democratic Party right now, in some sense. So if you sort of put all these huge problems that are being faced on a structural level that need to sort of be tackled by responsible politics, and there's very little responsible politics coming down the line, you have to ask yourself, well, what is the best thing to do? What's the best priority? And I would just say, you work with what you have. And right now, Trump is really good at exemplifying the problem with the so-called left. Run with it. Why play this strange arbitration where nothing is good enough for you and whatever? Like, help him in doing what he's already doing, in some sense, and add your layer of complexity to it in some sense, and to neaten it up, and to sort of maybe to steal the thunder or whatever. But I mean, perhaps this is the function of Victor Hansen, and it's sad that Victor Hansen doesn't have a bigger platform in some sense. But the kind of, you know, sort of, you make the progress that you can that's available, and that's sort of, you know, that's timely in some sense. You know, Trump is here, he's doing something for the culture war. Amplify that effect, because then that'll accelerate perhaps some resolution to the shit show that is the Democratic Party. Perhaps that'll hasten its reform, when essentially people that supposedly are its intellectual wing abandon it because of its disgusting fascistic groupthink and racial, tribal sentimentality, and playing on, you know, whatever. Identity politics, the toxic woke stuff is just so toxic that is something that is more important to remove from the political equation than it is to sort of say, well, Trump isn't the perfect political leader of the free world. You know, it sort of it somewhat boggles my mind. You know, the kind of because that kind of having that kind of high standard, let's just say, before you can get behind anything or lend any kind of credence or positivity to anything, and sort of work with the current or handle the current situation, is to me that sort of reticence is a form of sort of irresponsibility, is a form of sort of, you know, oh, there should just be a magical groupthink that just sort of is more in tune with all this stuff already, and I'm just going to wait until that precipitates. I'm not going to sort of and I'm going to sort of protest by disengaging until that rears its head. And so if that is your position, to me it is childish, and it is a sort of a self-made hell. And so I do think that Eric correctly named it his private hell. Okay. I think I've made my point. And sorry, I guess just to reiterate that point, that is to say that although the cultural part what I'm saying is that the cultural part of the political equation is not being respected enough by liberal intellectuals in some sense, and even, you know, people that have faced tremendous things like Bret, in some sense, they're not prioritizing. Perhaps they're not prioritizing it because they don't want to be seen as a kind of as speaking on their own behalf, speaking as the sort of as a judge in their own case in terms of Bret's experience of. So yeah, I do think in some sense that in some sense I think that this is also, I mean, ironically, this is the sort of, I would call this a lack of leadership in some sense, a lack of intellectual leadership, which you know, in some sense, perhaps I'm calling for not just pure intellectualism. I'm calling for a sense of sort of a moral thread that is being justified in real time and commenting on present politics, and not just sort of abstract political sort of ideal cases or something like that. Maybe that's the real distance here, and so there doesn't appear to be such a problem with what I'm pointing out and criticizing. Which is somewhat ironic with all the things that Bret have said, at least in what Bret has said about leadership. And I mean, yes, he does have a sort of his alternative solution in I can't remember what he called it, the 2024 or 2025 thing, or the sort of, the kind of the reset button on politics, that you can sort of make this new party that will take over so that it gives the other parties space to kind of completely reinvent themselves and reinvent politics, or maybe even the party that he's hoping to construct that everyone will vote for will kind of implement a kind of campaign reform that will clean up politics, to make the party structures in their capture of those parties sort of impossible, because essentially, like, I guess one of the solutions would be you could have completely public funded elections that essentially that you have a special sort of cable channel that's set up, and the only sort of coverage of elections is on that channel or something like that, and it's sort of purely open source, and it's sort of like it's all based on sort of like people signing signatures to make people a candidate, and then they get their equal time in some debating system or something like that, or essentially you take commerce out of the election completely somehow. That's a crazy idea, or something like that. But or you have some kind of campaign reform that just makes it less beholden to big donors or something like that. I've thought that there are structural problems in politics, in that, like, it's very hard to have an adversarial political system because the loser has to, if you want to be involved in politics, you have to win, because if you lose, then you don't have a job. So that already kind of is a structural flaw, because that means that if you're not friends with rich people that support you when you lose, then you can't really afford to be in politics. So it's sort of like already the political system sort of, can only really be conducted by people who have a very, what's the word, amenable, sort of economic independence or something like that, that are very sort of, and that to me is a fundamental flaw. You could fix that by having a kind of a shadow house. You could have a sort of a shadow house of parliament, in which it kind of, where the losers would essentially become, they would conduct their own debates and their own policy, development in some sense, as a kind of publicly funded think tank, that they would be there to criticize the government and effectively also be a kind of journalistic sort of, fulfill a kind of journalistic public, sort of, and they could have their own internal shadow cabinets and things like that. And it's essentially just a kind of think tank of policy possibility in some sense. And so they're part of the debate, and maybe they would even bring certain debates into the House of Parliament of the actual elected officials, but essentially that they would kind of be a sort of just there propagating an alternative to everything going on in the actual elected chamber. So you would kind of have a shadow house of politics, and then essentially you could be a loser, and as long as you were a successful enough loser, then you could kind of if you were the runner-up or whatever, you get to go to the shadow house. Anyway, that there are, in some sense, I think politics does need a kind of renaissance, perhaps on that kind of structural level, but it also, maybe just, the campaign reform would essentially might be enough as well. But I think that kind of more elaborate sort of solution might be a more permanent sort of fix to this, because then essentially you would have a kind of partisan journalistic sort of thing being projected from the shadow house, and then essentially the media could actually comment and question both of them objectively and actually play a kind of just airing stories and not actually be a kind of activist journalist, and you could just have journalism being less of a kind of a partisan sort of propaganda as well, that might sort of allow that to precipitate as okay. Anyway, let me stop this recording. I guess I want to get deeper into this sort of criticism that I'm generating, I guess, about Eric Weinstein's attitude, and I don't mean this in a harsh, eviscerating way. I hope to impart this in a useful way, that because there are sort of nuanced issues here in some sense. Now, in some way, I think that there is a level of toxic complicity with the woke crowd when you sort of buy into the narrative that, like, Trump is causing the wokeness or something like that, when he is obviously the answer to it after it has already manifested in such a harsh way from the so-called left. And the idea that, for example, that he's dog whistling racism or something like that, when he's really just not speaking politically correctly, and then to sort of lend credence that to not speak politically correctly is to dog whistle racism, essentially, because we have lost, let's say, the basic foundation of principle that governs a properly liberal society, that, you don't sort of, just because you're not giving this whole systemic oppression narrative its due, that you are, like, overtly racist or something like that. So the idea, and this came out in Eric's interview with his interviewee, or conversation or discussion, where he asked Eric, well, whose fault is that? Is that really, isn't that the left's fault? Isn't that not Donald Trump's fault that they're taking the bait, as it were? But in some sense, to say take the bait is as if Trump is orchestrating this when he's really just answering it. He is playing it up in the other side because it needs to have the light of day shone on it. And in some sense, I think that to misinterpret Trump so badly and to go along with this maligning that the mainstream media has against him and such is to, in some sense, is to seed the whole political arena into the narrative that's happening, is to disengage, is to fundamentally disengage from what's happening. And in some sense, it's because perhaps Eric just doesn't want to stomach or countenance having to, like, actually put through some basic, to broadcast some leadership in terms of iterating some basic values and principles, because he just considers them to be so trite, so beyond mention, because they're just so obvious, that he believes in a liberal society, in a free society, that he doesn't want to sort of join in the chorus of what is branded as the Trump brand, as, saying obviously freedom is good or something like that. He doesn't want to be sort of typecast or something like that. And I just want to sort of bring in this principle or whatever, or it's not really, it's a rationale in some sense, that Jung brought to bear, where he says, what you resist persists. And in some sense, the disengagement in the actual political arena and the lack of sort of broadcasting just, obvious proclamations that I think are necessary in this chaotic time of just utter nonsense and utter mediocre, that you do need to have a basic agreement on a certain cultural edifice, which is under attack from the so-called left. And to be blind to that because you don't want to go along with providing political partisan support for people who are nominally on the right is, I think, to miss the boat completely, and also is to disengage and to by showing a kind of lack of leadership in terms of the intellectual leadership which is needed on the left, it sort of allows bad people to own the movement. It robs the movement of its rightful place in the center of politics. And it also, because of the disownership from people like Eric and the disengagement, it allows other people to then own the movement, when essentially that could have been frankly displaced by a more agree but disagree on certain details or something like that. But to sort of to try to shirk the point at which you actually announce some level of agreement, which must be, because of the principles that are under attack and the principles that are being essentially relied on and exhorted by the Trump sort of brand, to sort of is to miss the boat of this, sort of opportunity in the current sort of political space, and almost to sort of to vacate the political arena because you want to have your reticence and your arms folded and just wait for a better situation to emerge that's going to sort of organically just generate itself because you're waiting with arms folded. And I think that is a level of resistance which is part of the recipe of the persistence of this never-ending, leaderless paradigm on the left. That there is no hope that the left can coalesce a renaissance of its, and in some sense I do think that this is a holdover of how the kind of the paradigm of the left occupying the moral majority, of just assuming that they occupied that space of the moral majority, and sort of that their brand was right and the right wing brand was wrong. Just sort of automatically you could presume that on every issue across the board. And essentially this is also, I think, part of perhaps Eric's reluctance to reorientate his political compass according to the kind of the polarity of classical liberal sort of center and against authoritarianism, which has many different valences. But and in some sense, to me, it makes me wonder, well, is Eric doing this because he is such a nuanced and sophisticated thinker that he needs to keep his powder dry, so that if it turns out that capitalism is just so broken in so many ways and we have so many pressing concerns that we have to deal with, like the environment, that we might just have to sort of import wholesale state capitalism or state socialism measures in order to sort of right the ship. And he's just trying to sort of, he doesn't want to say too many vague things about pro-liberty, pro-individualism, because, he's keeping his powder dry, so much so that he can't have his brand, his intellectual brand, tainted by any kind of association with sort of engaging in the cultural wars other than sort of in his own reticence. And I do think that this is the time to sort of to make manifestos of basic principle and things like that, and then aligning those basic principles with possible policies and the underlining of how those policies are just fundamentally ill-conceived and morally corrupt. Which Eric Weinstein, I think, could be a leader on that front. But it's beneath him to some extent, and he's disengaged and he has disowned, and so he says that he inhabits his private hell of being the anti-Trumpers. Was that everything that I wanted to say? Yeah, and ironically, in some sense, that leaves a bit of a vacuum, an intellectual vacuum, for the movement to be, let's say, adopted by malevolent or actually pathological, sort of, because decent people have ceded the political arena. They've just evacuated. Because they're not dignifying the center where the center should be found. They are, helping to create this conspiracy theory that the woke left has generated, and essentially mirror that, because I don't know. I see it as a kind of as a fearfulness of essentially that they don't want to be typecast as a kind of as a patsy, or as a sort of I don't know, like as an Uncle Tom for the left wing groupthink or whatever. And I understand that these people are intellectually very aware of these things, but I do think that they have nesciently fallen into that trope. They have fallen into that kind of tactical fear-based, it's almost like that they have been painted into the corner, not by President Trump, but by the left. And their unwillingness to sort of see that coercive subtextual manipulation is a weakness. And I do think that Dr. Or is it Professor Victor Hansen, essentially, I think, would bring this to bear if he was part of the dialogue more directly of engaging with these other people in the intellectual dark web, which is sort of predominantly, I consider myself I consider myself a Marxist, but that's, and all of Marxist analysis, but my prescription of what I believe Marxism sort of, anyway, I'm not going to get into that, but certainly I'm not a Marxist, sort of a red beret wearing Marxist. I don't believe in state revolution. I believe that it can all be done in the private sphere, within the machinery of a default system that is essentially a capitalistic. I think that is actually the best container for the revolution to occur within. That it never has anything to do with state power. Anyway, that's a different issue entirely. But so maybe other people, because they don't have, I don't want to say that this is so denigrating to say about other, because they don't have such a sort of concrete an outline of what a moral workable solution would be. They have to keep their powder dry, and they have to watch out, because essentially they don't have they don't have an internal locus of control in respect to the bridge of where this thing is going to go, sort of on the societal level, and so they have to be too cautious about their involvement and participation in politics, and that essentially makes them essentially disengaged and fundamentally sort of prone to the kind of subtextual sort of manipulation. That is being generated by the fact that there are these narratives, and you can't navigate these narratives because especially when you're generally on Team Blue, and then you don't want to give too much leeway to Team Red or something like that, and I would also say that isn't to properly prioritize the cultural mess that we are in. And I do think that it would help even facilitate the renaissance of the left if people could identify that the principles that Trump essentially relies on in his intuitive communication of ideas and things like that is where the center is, and stop allowing him to profit on being the only person occupying the center ground. But no, your reticence essentially means that he will still continue to be the only person occupying basic common sense principles, because no one else can go through the obvious sort of reciting of those basic principles, so he is the only one that can inculcate them into his brand, in some sense. And while you add to this conspiracy theory against him that he doesn't really represent those those principles in his brand, and he's just like I don't know, just sort of crazy bullshit about him being a fascist or an authoritarian. I mean, he hates the rich. He literally does. He's not in their class of socializing. He doesn't. He's never been. He's never been the member of their club. He just happened to essentially maybe own some of the places in which they might meet or congregate or something like that. But he's not one of them, and he doesn't really like them. And I mean, there is a lot of I think the dysfunction in American politics just has to do with just how bad the journalism is, because then if you can't have a functioning democracy if you don't have a functioning free press and sense-making apparatus. And so because the apparatus is so embroiled in this narrative partisan bullshit, you can't get the president to respond to things in a natural, ordinary sort of business as usual, politics as usual, because it's so tainted by this hysterical, ludicrous, absurd, sort of conspiracism against him and magical thinking. And to me, it seems that Eric Weinstein and Bret Weinstein as well to some degree has just been completely intellectually disengaged by that. Instead of handling that, sort of directly confronting it, have allowed it almost to metastasize by not being more capable of showing support for Trump in the unfairness of the context in which you have to try to be a democratic leader in a dysfunctional democracy because journalism is so poisonous and toxic. And then to pretend as if that isn't the proximate cause of the dysfunction, and then to sort of buy into the fake narrative, or to give it play, to give the conspiracy theory sort of more play than it deserves, than it should ever deserve to have. So in some sense, I do think that there's a kind of, and this has to do with, I think, how the left has been inbred into operating intellectually, and I do think that Eric and Bret are still somewhat infected by this, and this would be the kind of the recurring manifestation of that theme, or the holdover residue of that theme. So anyway, I wanted to point that out. Maybe I should try to articulate that again, but I do think that I did point that out in the other recordings, in terms of the groupthink, kind of the idea that the groupthink is going to be the vehicle of progress, essentially, and that is how the line is held, instead of by like direct engagement with the issue and hands-on, that it's part of this idealism, intellectual idealism, that everything is juxtaposed or contrasted against. So I guess I'm going to continue talking about Eric and bring in also the issue of COVID-19, because I think it's it's a good example of to illustrate the points that I'm going to be making. So in some sense, I do really think that in some sense Trump is to a large extent blameless for let's say, not doing tangible things that need to be done for structural reform because the media is just so ludicrously, absurdly distracted with bullshit and made up narratives and stuff like that. COVID almost being an example of this. And I do think that it wouldn't go amiss for Eric, for someone like Eric, to say, I would rather choose Donald Trump being the president and having the semblance, the superficial structure of liberty and let's say and a healthy politics, even if it's hollow rhetoric, that even a hollow rhetoric of something that is vital and important and robust to just keeping liberal democracy alive in some sense is more important than aligning myself politically with like Joe Biden, who will, under his watch, if he did get into the presidency, would essentially, there would be the authoritarian wokeness would be on high, would be plugged in at the highest echelon of political decision making. I mean, you sort of the creep of literal USSR style totalitarianism into the institutions. That essentially the idea that it's better to have a hollow rhetoric that is at least got its principles in order, even if the principles aren't being lived up to, but at least superficially, that gives one a lot more freedom and an important cultural avenue in which one can still at least exist as a free people and try to work out the problems. Even if the freedom is a lie, it is a better system to operate under. It's a better fiction. It's a better default system within which to operate, in which that it's possible to precipitate any kind of hopeful future and progressive politics in the old sense of progress, rather than this new totalitarian fascistic so-called progress. And in some sense, I do think Trump is blameless for, let's say, not cleaning up the swamp in a structural way, because it's not within his power, especially not with the American media so hysterically pandering to the woke left and providing them outrage for them to consume. And and I do want to contrast something, because there are substantive issues that I think people have been captured by. For example, COVID-19 is just utterly insane. It really is. I think that if you put SARS under a microscope and you compare the outbreak that occurred under Obama and the outbreak that occurred now, scientifically in the future, that this will be ascertained, that the original SARS outbreak under Obama, that strain was actually more dangerous. It was more it was more virulent. The rate of spread of the contamination was higher. It was a more dangerous strain, and also we were relatively completely new to experiencing SARS. So was it the swine? The 2002 to 2004 outbreak. Or 2003 to 2004. Anyway, my dates. Anyway, I mean, there were shortages in the hospitals during Obama. It's just that essentially people. What is the difference between the Obama outbreak and the Trump outbreak? Is that basically people trusted the political leadership and just followed their lead in essence. The attitude of the political leadership was just sort of mimicked in terms of the response or the reaction to the issue was just replicated by the media. No investigation, nothing. And in some sense, the reaction to COVID-19 is certainly worse. The treatment is worse than the disease. We can say that for a fact, because in some sense, there is no such thing. You cannot eradicate this thing. There's no there's no point in suppressing its spread. You can only ever hope to protect a minority of people from the virus by essentially getting them to practice social distancing while everyone else sort of garners herd immunity to protect them. But the slower the spread, the longer the exposure you have to the virus within human bodies, you're giving it a longer time for it to mutate as well. It becomes more dangerous even, but also you defer herd immunity, you delay herd immunity. For what end? There's no reason to delay it. So it's utterly, it is just the mismanagement of this, which has been essentially led by the media. The media has just bought into this. Sweden is the only country that has had an intelligent response to the COVID-19 crisis, in inverted commas, which is really no different than what happened during the Obama years, in which that was just weathered, that was just tolerated, that was just taken in stride, and it was by far a better response, essentially. Essentially, the whole hysteria over COVID-19 was essentially precipitated by the Imperial College study, which is so junk it will never be peer-reviewed. And that is, even if it is peer-reviewed, it's sort of irrelevant, but essentially we know for a fact that it proceeds from an incorrect premise, which is that the incidents and the incidence fatality were basically representative of the case fatality rate, because it was assumed that all the incidents that they were seeing were like that the virus had just landed. And so the numbers that they were seeing were assumed that essentially there was an insignificant proportion of asymptomatic cases, which was, all the real experts knew that was an utterly incorrect presumption. They knew that essentially, I mean, Oxford was saying right from the start, Professor Suneta Gupta said it's most probably that even half the population already has it and they're asymptomatic. Or that at least half the population has it, and up to 80% of those people are just asymptomatic. So the incidence fatality, and these people have said from the start, the government should not be publishing confirmed cases. It's a bunk statistic. It's just trash. Like, why are you telling people how many confirmed cases there are? It's utterly irrelevant. I mean, to a large extent, unless you can actually fathom eradication, which no one in the West can fathom, there's no point in tracing and tracking people. What is the point of that? Unless you're going to eradicate it, what's the point in tracing and tracking the symptomatic cases when you can't track the asymptomatic cases because you don't have broad testing? You don't have population-wide testing. So I mean, what's the point? If you're not going to track everyone with the virus, what's the point of just tracking the ones that show symptoms? It's like, it's just utterly, it's almost contemptible how sort of unintelligent and uninterrogated any of these sorts of these sentiments are, and these sort of the, anyway. So you get this hysterical fear mongering, outrage pandering machine. And I think in general, confronting that machine and taking it on by breaking its heuristics, breaking its rules, breaking its sensitivities, and rejecting it in total is what is needed. And that sort of thing would be like complimenting Trump and endorsing his general brand, even though having detailed criticism, essentially, is actually walking that line. As a platform for a real, genuine renaissance on the left or something like that. But essentially, I think that there is some trepidation that someone like Eric has, essentially, in fully endorsing like classical liberal values, as it were, that he wants to keep his perhaps he wants to keep his powder dry in those things. He doesn't want to make cultural commitments to certain cultural values, perhaps. Maybe that's it. And in some sense, I think that is also a holdover into how cerebrally protected the left was in being able to sort of orchestrate its idealism, and just sort of ploddingly plot how politics should be functioning, and in a surreal fashion, in such a detached fashion, um, peddling a kind of political strategy in best fitting their ideal scenario, instead of actually dealing with the culture, which is the most hands-on thing that precipitates the actual political. So by relegating the cultural arena to some extent, and in terms and how it's interfacing with the political arena, sort of by vacating that ground entirely, I think there's no real bridge to like actually having an authentic political culture until a new center is found and politics gravitates towards that center, and it grounds everything in a certain, and that does need certain principles. It does need certain cultural principles and values. Um, and those principles and values, I think, they don't only go understated, but they go undermined when you try to take on this position of being anti-Trumpers. You do have to precipitate some kind of navigational compass of what the chaos is in the current sort of. Yes, it's always this malleable sort of amorphous hysteria, but until one actually gets one's hands on that slippery eel to sort of to quell this this psychological leviathan of chaos and hysteria, um, I think that the resistance to that kind of hands-on um, grappling with it, in some sense, means that it's sort of its narrative enemy gets to sort of take the middle ground, without any uh, other, without the vibrant sort of chorus of people that are reasonable and sort of invested in some kind of common sense, that are inhabiting the same space in some sense. I mean, I guess I've said this before, but in some sense, the culture must be prioritized at some point, and people must say, well, for culture, uh, it's important that Biden loses and that the Democrats lose. It is more important that they lose. That the kind of the cultural concession that would be made if they won would not be worth it. Would be dangerous. That the Democrats certainly do not deserve power. you know, Romney, I guess, is the kind of is the Republican version of Joe Biden, and if Romney was the candidate, then that would be just as problematic, in some sense. If it was Romney versus Joe Biden, then perhaps it would be the same difference in some sense, but it's not. That's not the contest. Um, anyway, I guess I've just sort of now I'm just sort of repeating myself inanely. Just to put it a slightly different way, and this is slightly more critical and unflattering to Eric or whatever, is that essentially the despondency in the interview that I saw, where it was raised to him in response to the left being baited by Trump's vague language, which they are politically reading into the political correctness because of their racially obsessed worldview and their other things, and they're being baited by Trump. That then his interviewee asked him, "Well, whose fault is that?" And Eric's despondency on this concept of fault, which then allows him to be disconnected and disengaged, or disembodied and abstract and hypothetical about this moral sanctimony that he's conserving for himself. Therefore, it looks like a mechanism of intellectual bad faith to some degree. It looks like a form of sort of an intellectual defense mechanism of sort of, you know, you need to be in the middle of a moral majority to sort of be able to be an intellectual. You can't sort of be on the front line ever. You can't allow yourself to sort of to be in the midst of the fray. That you see yourself as a general of this movement, and you just can't function when essentially you're already not on the winning side or something like that. And to me, it speaks of the culture of the left and how it has, which is a decadent culture. And I do see even Bret, as well as Eric, as having residual traces of this lazy moral intellectualism. Reticence, arms folded, looking from above onto the situation. Okay, that's because the despondency on the level of assigning fault in the particular hysterical narrative that's being woven, that looks, it's remiss. There's an omission occurring there. It is a form of nescience, and I'm pointing it out. I don't know how clear the last point was, so I'm going to reiterate it very carefully and slowly. So essentially, in the despondency, and I mean, perhaps that's a bit of a projection, but it's also therefore just a sort of a metaphor anyway. So it doesn't have to be like an actual despondency, but essentially in the sentiment that Eric exudes when he is functionally despondent in the face of being retorted to or being asked, well, whose fault is that? And he doesn't want to deal with that issue. He's despondent to that line of thinking. So he's despondent to that question of apportioning fault. So that despondency in apportioning fault, in some sense, aids his what I would essentially call a kind of intellectual dispersal of reapportioning that fault. That issue of fault is dispersed into his general intellectual edifice or framework, in which he can just kind of allocate that lagging issue of who to apportion fault to. Well, it's just kind of a conspiracy that I'm going to blame Trump for, which is obviously unfair. That is obviously an unfair thing to do, when he is obviously the answer and the response to this toxicity that has been bred in the left. But you're going to put it on his door. You're going to put it on his conscience. You're going to lay the blame at his feet, which is just really part of the narrative inception of the woke left anyway, that, oh, it's systemic oppression, so we can just apportion blame as we relativistically, subjectively decide to do it, to apportion it. So in some sense, I do see it as a kind of as a mini representative thing of the hysterical delusional thinking around a subject into sort of using a kind of pretentious intellectual framing to be able to, in an ad hoc fashion, sort of apportion the conspiracy where because it's just convenient for your overarching, let's say, ideological design, so you can disengage and disconnect from finding fault or finding who's at fault in the actual issue, and you can just kind of override it with a kind of narrative, ideological narrative. To me, it seems very representative of that, and again, I'm pointing it out because to me it's incredibly worrisome that even people who are on the outside of the woke machine are so contorted, essentially almost by its strategy and by its propaganda, that they, even as they directly oppose it, that they seem to be within its grasp. So I am pointing it out earnestly, that this dimension needs attention. This, what I would even call a kind of convenient and selective reticence that's somewhat even strategically justified, or in terms of in terms of how it's being internally rationalized. Because I mean, obviously, this strategy or this attitude is being rationalized by Eric and Bret and even Sam and things like that. And to me, I see them all as being captured by this mechanism, essentially. And in some sense, it's a kind of partisan bad faith in some sense that, well, I have to be very careful not to look like I'm batting for the red team because I'm on team blue, even though that I know that my team needs new management and it, it should actually lose a few seasons so that they can have the compunction to fire their management and get new management. But I'm still team blue, and I'm still, and I need to strategically keep that sort of thing open. So I'll just sort of put on these strategic blinders on my interpretation of the scenario, and don't venture too far into cheering for Team Red or something like that. I mean, it seems to sort of, anyway. And perhaps the true solution would be to disavow yourself from the Democratic Party and call yourself a free agent and allow yourself to flirt with supporting the other team in a lot of its themes, and say, well, I wish that a new team would emerge that would be representative of my other ideological preferences. But until they do, I consider myself a free agent, and I consider it good to flirt with the virtue of the other side, or at least the virtue that the brand of the other side is rhetorically one and the same with. But the kind of the unexplored territory in this, to me, is ground that has just been ceded to the obviously toxic elements. It has been a victory for essentially for the woke fascistic groupthink, essentially, and playing into it. And in as much as that this cultural progress is not being made in the culture war, the idea that you can still have an eye as to the political ramifications of where you would like to be but where we're not, but you want to sort of clean up politics before you clean up culture, that I think is a that the idea that you're still going to be fixated on a kind of political puritanism, while the culture is just no way close to being mature enough or developed enough to seriously deal with any of those issues. And I do see this as somewhat a lack of leadership, but also, I mean, maybe it's a sort of it's a political strategy sort of issue as well. But I see these people that, I mean, I can only call it a kind of nescience or nescient bad faith in some sense. Anyway, where they're just trying to nominally keep their credentials clean, that they are on that they're on the side of the moral majority or something like that. Trying to cultivate a group think that they deserve to be in the center or in the midst of. Okay, this is yet another addendum. I know I've been reiterating this thing to absolute death, but let me just say one more thing. So, sort of like the despondency to the question of actually apportioning fault is being overridden in a sense by this very nescient bad faith sentimentality, which is the idea is that no, don't ask me your question about apportioning fault. I'm asking my own more important sanctimonious question, which is that who can I blame because this shouldn't even be happening. So let me sanctimoniously give you a narrative about who, and then that blame just naturally gravitates towards the person who happens to ostensibly, superficially be in charge of things. And so you blame Donald Trump for baiting these people or something like that. Instead of journalism, instead of the whole woke establishment, instead of the whole left apparatus that is so toxic and useless and hollow and vacuous, and essentially how you can't even have a proper democracy because there isn't a real good faith or a substantive disagreement being leveraged against Trump. So what do you expect? I mean, if Trump is being hounded by nonsense constantly, and then essentially I think that in this deluge of overload, then the bullshit gets through, because then it's like, oh well, then obviously yes, he's not doing COVID-19 properly or something like that. The response is not correct, when in the whole response is a complete overshoot in some sense, that you should have something like what the Obama response was to the original SARS outbreak, which was effectively to do almost nothing except try to put some more resources towards hospitals. Essentially that's it. That was the only response, and it was hardly even reported on. The surrealism, the hyperrealism around this and that hyperrealism is inculcated because people in the middle, or people who are common sense or decent, can't just say, well, roughly Trump is actually right about all these things and this is all hysterical nonsense, and the media can't be on his case about anything reasonable because they're more of a joke than ostensibly he is. And he is standing for the right principles, essentially, and the accusations against him are just completely nonsense. They're the kind of identity politics, politically correct Gestapo bullshit, hyperrealism propaganda arm of this ideology, the one-party ideology, or the cultural takeover propaganda wing that is the mainstream media. Until you start to apportion fault and you say, well, no, the problem is that journalism is fundamentally bankrupt, morally bankrupt, ethically bankrupt. They have been captured by this ideology. In Britain, it's just as bad with the BBC. um, or all over the world, essentially. In most of the Anglosphere, the journalism is effectively dead, because it has to cater to this pseudo-intellectual, academically credentialed mafia, protection racket. And so you have to join the witch hunt, you have to join the hysterical thing, and I do see that as being catered to in this insulating strategy or disconnected strategy that Eric is engaged in. And I mean, I'm picking on Eric, I guess, because it's manifesting in an overt form on his podcast to the degree that in this kind of example sort of thing. But I think this is why his audience sometimes has it out for him, because it is an obtuse treatment of the situation. It is a disconnected treatment of the situation. And Bret, to a similar degree, I feel, makes similar rhetorical concessions. Though I have seen Bret saying sort of mealy-mouthed things about Trump, in which he's sort of sitting on the fence a little bit in some kind of intellect, but he's very actually, even not even sitting on the fence, because he intellectually says something sort of double, what's the word? That it's sort of like a slap in the face, a compliment. It's that kind of slap, and it's a very delimited intellectual compliment and a general moral indictment against Trump. That's usually what Bret sort of manufactures. But anyway. And Sam is just, I don't know, it's just complete lunacy. It's just partisan lunacy as far as I can see, especially with the interview with Yang.